Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young Kim. As many watchers have predicted, North Korea fired short-range ballistic missiles, staging the first provocation since U.S. President Joe Biden took office. President Biden called the launch a violation of a UN Security Council resolution and said the U.S. will respond accordingly if North Korea chooses to escalate. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Frank senior expert on North Korea at the United States Institute of Peace. Mr. Worked at the Department of Defense, advising 4 different secretaries of defense on issues related to the Korean Peninsula. Scott Snyder also joins me today. Mr. Snyder is director of the program on U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's authored numerous books on the Korean Peninsula, with the latest being South Korea at the Crossroads. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Young.
Thank you.
A day after North Korea's latest missile tests were detected, North Korea confirmed it has tested a pair of guided missiles. Mr. Was North Korea's actions something that were expected?
Well, I think many North Korea watchers were expecting Pyongyang to conduct some sort of action to express its displeasure about the policy signals that Washington is hinting at, and also expecting Pyongyang to try to increase pressure on Washington. And we know that North Korea was unhappy because of the recent statements by Kim Yo-jong and Choi Sun-hee. Of course, we didn't know exactly when these sorts of provocations would happen, but given the context with Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin in the region, with the continuation of the joint military exercises, and the talk that Secretary Blinken has been making about increasing pressure on North Korea, I think North Korea's actions are not surprising.
Mr. Snyder, this missile test took place right after Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin finished their visits to Japan and South Korea. Do you think this latest test was something expected in Washington overall?
I actually think that the test was widely anticipated in one form or another, in part because North Korea has an ongoing need for testing, and North Korea has a record of trying to combine its need for testing with the right political moment to send signals. And so I actually think that what is interesting about this particular series of tests is that, as Frank suggested, they're taking a step-by-step approach, and that's a very cautious approach in order to kind of read the U.S. reaction. And also, I think it's notable that it comes after a year of no testing. The last test of this sort occurred in March of 2020.
President Biden said the launch of 2 short-range ballistic missiles run in violation of a UN Security Council resolution. And he said the U.S. will respond accordingly if North Korea chooses to escalate. How do you make of this, Mr.
Well, I think these latest ballistic missile launches will be a good first test for how the Biden administration will respond to things like short-range missile tests, which the U.S. has typically tended to downplay. I think we may see the Biden administration say, they've already said, that they will respond if there are further escalations, but it's unclear what additional steps the Biden administration will take.
Mr. Snyder, President Biden added that diplomacy is still possible, but it has to be conditioned upon the end result of denuclearization. How do you interpret this?
Well, that is a very interesting and important statement of U.S. policy objectives. And it is one that is going to be very challenging to the North Koreans, because I think that what they are looking for is tacit acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear state, as the basis upon which to pursue dialogue. And so I think the real question that it raises is it's natural that the U.S. would focus on denuclearization as an objective, but what we still don't know is whether the Biden administration approach is going to be a denuclearization only approach to North Korea, or a denuclearization plus approach, which would generate potential space for diplomacy outside of the 2 poles represented by the U.S. and DPRK of denuclearization versus normalization of relations.
Mr. What is the message President Biden is sending here?
Well, I think we should take the message at face value that he's open to diplomacy. But again, the ultimate outcome of diplomacy has to be denuclearization, and not some deal that allows North Korea to keep their nuclear weapons. But so I think as a general statement, it's fine and it's good that he's signaling this. My concern here is that President Biden missed a big opportunity. The U.S. has already signaled that it's open to talks, and North Korea has rejected the U.S.'s outreach because they recognize that it's the U.S. is trying to present it as diplomacy, but on their terms, right? Which is focusing on North Korea's denuclearization. I think if you're trying to appeal to someone as a part of a courtship process, it's not really an attractive proposition to say, hey, North Korea, we're open to dating, but again, the other person has to commit to marriage right now. It doesn't seem like a very enticing proposition. I think Biden could have really seized the narrative and the initiative here by saying, hey, North Korea, we want to have talks that establish new US-DPRK relations that will establish a lasting peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, as well as complete denuclearization. So we are going to reaffirm the Singapore statement. And we look forward to your response. I think that would have set the tone in much a different frame.
Mm-hmm. Mr. North Korea is obviously ramping up its pressure on the new U.S. administration. How will the Biden team, what immediate action can Biden team take here?
Well, it depends. I mean, if you're talking about the recent missile tests, I'm not sure there's going to be much more actions taken beyond what, which is again trying to have a discussion at the Sanctions Committee. And the statement of condemnation and the reassurance of a lot of allies that President Biden said. I think going forward, if you're talking about the broader policy, then we're going to have the results of the policy review pretty soon. I don't know if it will necessarily be very clear, like what we saw in the Trump administration, where they said very explicitly, this is a maximum pressure and engagement policy. We might not have that obvious of a slogan, but that's what we're probably going to see. But again, I'm not sure if we're going to have a very proactive approach from the Biden administration, and that's the concerning part.
Mr. Snyder, North Korea returned to a show of force. How will the U.S. stand up to this kind of pressure?
Well, I think in a fashion that has been elaborated so far, the U.S. is, identifying this act as contrary to the sanctions resolutions. And we recognize, I think the U.S. government is bound to recognize that the North Koreans are going to want to try to shape the environment to its advantage. The response to North Korea's tit for tat turns out, I think, based on President Biden's statement, to be that the U.S. is also going to view North Korea's actions in a tit for tat fashion. And I think that what that does is it establishes mutuality on both sides and mutual responsibility for exercising self-restraint. Whereas the North Korean unilateral statement of tit for tat kind of left open the idea that North Korea could do what it wanted, but if the U.S. did anything negative, that that North Korea was inevitably going to respond. And in a negative fashion. And so now I think that we have a little bit more balance, a little bit more mutuality, and actually an implicit expectation that both sides can exercise self-restraint as a way of avoiding the worst. And then the question is whether or not something can be built through diplomatic engagement.
I want to get back to Scott's point about mutuality, because I feel like this is the dilemma, because we get into this back and forth response where both sides are trying to exert leverage on each other. And we get into this cycle and spiral where it just increases tension on the peninsula. I also want to point out that, I don't see any empirical evidence of pressure working. So from the period of the 6-year period between 2012 to 2018, which was the longest period that the U.S. did not engage with North Korea over the last 30 years, and instead applied pressure. This is precisely the time where we saw North Korea achieve the greatest advancements in its nuclear weapons program, including 4 nuclear tests of progressively greater yield and over 80 ballistic missile tests, including some at an intercontinental range, right? And then conversely, when we did engage aggressively with North Korea, I'm talking about the period in the 90s and also even the Trump-Kim period over the last several years, we actually saw tangible benefits to our security. This includes North Korea signing on to the IAEA Safeguards Agreement, shutting down Yongbyon, not reprocessing plutonium, declaring a moratorium on their ballistic missile and nuclear testing. So I think we need to go to what we think has worked in the past. And it's clear to me, at least, that pressure is not working, and it only causes this security dilemma where both sides have to respond in a mutual fashion to feel like they are more secure.
But Mr. In the past, there were a number of agreements between the United States and North Korea, and there were even agreements between the international community and North Korea. But it didn't go through all the way, did it?
Sure. I think both sides can point to agreements that they agreed to, and they were and one or the other side backed out, whether it's the agreed framework or our agreements at the 6-party talks. But what we should focus on right now is the agreement that is still on the books, the one that was signed by the leader Kim Jong-un and President Trump, which is the Singapore Declaration. I think that provides a good anchor for us to base our diplomacy off of. And again, it's an agreement that North Korea has not yet renounced. So I think that's a good starting point.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, go ahead.
I'll just respond to that. I read the history a little bit differently from Frank because I think that, after 30 years of trying to deal with North Korea's persistent efforts to achieve nuclear development, one thing that I think that we can say is that North Korea has maintained a consistent political will toward that objective. And I think that has occurred regardless of whether there were agreements that seems to be succeeding or whether or not they failed. And of course, the reason for that is where I think Frank and I probably would agree. North Korea perceives that the U.S. policy toward it is indeed hostile. And so that is the key driver for North Korea's desire to achieve security through attaining nuclear weapons. But the task of closing that gap, given the history and given the nature of North Korea's regime as an outlier in the international system, is one that is inevitably going to take time. And it's really not at all clear that the North Koreans can see a better way from their perspective than to rely on and pursue a nuclear capability. So we have a real challenge here. It's not going to be a situation that is going to change in a single moment. There are things that I think that we can do on the margins in order to make it better. But until that core issue of mutual hostility is challenged by a new narrative, it's going to be very difficult to imagine that the trajectory is going to change.
Well, the Biden administration says it is in the final stage of reviewing its policy on North Korea. Mr. How do you think the latest test will affect the North Korean policy?
I don't think that the tests will affect the policy in a broader sense. Again, like I said, the U.S. government could be looking at ways to modify its force posture to better defend against these types of additional capabilities from North Korea, as well as reassure our allies. But again, I think the policy is at this point probably already set. The question is how the policy will be revealed, messaged, and implemented.
Actually, what I would point to that I think remains outstanding that the policy review, in my view, should really focus on, is actually going back to Choi Sun-hee's statement, where she talks about how an atmosphere for both parties to exchange words on an equal basis must be created. And I think that the way of doing that is for the United States to take a tangible step. It's probably not going to be sanctions relaxation, but some other tangible step that is symbolic of our desire not to have a hostile relationship with the North Koreans. And this is where we need to be creative. I would note that the Biden administration has started to focus on vaccine provision as a vehicle for pursuing diplomatic goodwill, both in North America and in the context of the Quad. And so that may be one strand that could be pulled in order to try to send that signal.
The U.S. is soon to host a meeting of national security advisors with South Korea and Japan. What do you expect out of this meeting?
It would be helpful if the U.S. could signal in some way, obviously in a way that doesn't undermine our deterrence or our leverage, but in a way that shows North Korea that we are more than just open to diplomacy, but we actively want to establish a better relationship and enhance peace building on the Korean Peninsula. So I think it probably couldn't get to the level of something like suspending military exercises, but one example would be a moratorium, a unilateral moratorium on U.S. strategic and nuclear assets to the Korean Peninsula. North Korea has complained about this often. It's something that we could do. In fact, we may already be doing it somewhat, because I don't know if I've heard many reports about these types of deployments to the peninsula. But I agree with Scott. We need to be creative about showing how we want to engage with North Korea rather than coerce North Korea.
Scaling down the joint military exercise was not enough, you think?
Well, first of all, I don't think we should be doing anything that undermines our military readiness and deterrence. And so it's up to the military commanders to tailor the exercises in a way that creates the environment for diplomacy, but also maintains military readiness. And clearly, North Korea was unhappy about that. They've said it in their statements. And I'm not sure what more we can do other than suspending the exercises, but I don't think that's a good step to take at this point. So we have to be creative again. What other things can we do?
Mr. Snyder, the United States have been emphasizing the alliance between U.S., South Korea, and U.S. and Japan, and working towards North Korea. What are the realistic approaches that these three countries can adopt together towards North Korea?
Well, I think that actually is the purpose of the meeting among the national security advisors. It's really to try to reaffirm alliance cohesion as a foundation for a shared policy toward North Korea. And what that really involves is trying to make sure that the US, Japan, and South Korea are each aligned in terms of where they fall on the spectrum of relative emphasis between a deterrence-oriented policy and one that leans forward, focused on diplomatic engagement. And so if those three national security advisors can confirm that they're all in the same place in trying to achieve both sets of objectives, then I think the foundation will have been laid for the Biden administration to move forward in announcing its policy. And I think that both Frank and I are hopeful that there is still space for diplomatic engagement, but we have to, I think also be realistic that the nature of North Korea's strategic objectives and the way that they have framed them is actually likely to push all three in the direction of focusing on deterrence first and diplomacy second.
If I could just add, I think the U.S. and Japan seem to be on the same page. I think it's the positions of the U.S. and South Korea that seem to be more at odds, and we saw that at the recent 2+2 meeting, particularly the joint statement between the two countries, where there was no mention of denuclearization. And if you compare the 2+2 statement in 2016 with this year's 2+2 statement, the one back then 5 years ago was a lot more specific, more critical of North Korea, talked about imposing costs, talked about denuclearization. This year's statement was very bland. And then you had to go to the press conference remarks to get the nuances. Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong was talking about the Singapore statement. Secretary Blinken was non-committal. And so I think you're going to have to see a little bit more coming together between the two countries on North Korea policy.
Mr. Snyder, you have thought on this?
Yeah, I would just say that in terms of coordination among allies, I think that the position of the Biden administration on the Singapore Declaration is probably going to end up being the critical indicator that will come out as part of the policy review and is likely to be the one that may be most influential in dictating the course of action and North Korea's response.
Mm-hmm. As North Korea appears to have started a fresh cycle of provocations, President Biden is weighing both pressure and diplomacy with Pyongyang. We'll have to watch closely how this will progress into the next phase. Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.